Imagine two doctors examining the exact same patient, same blood pressure, same heart rate, same lab results. One says, "This patient is sick, we need aggressive treatment." The other says, "Actually, looking at this differently, the patient is nearly recovered." Same body, same data, completely different diagnosis. That is exactly what is happening right now at the Federal Reserve, and if you hold XRP, you need to understand why the doctor who just walked into the room could change everything. Here is what most people are missing. The conversation in financial media right now is all about when the Fed cuts rates. Will it be June? September? Arlio. Every analyst has a calendar in one hand and a prayer in the other, but nobody is asking the more dangerous question. What if the Fed doesn't just change when it cuts? What if it changes what it's measuring before it cuts? Because that is the quiet revolution happening right now, and it will matter more to XRP's price than any SEC ruling, any Ripple partnership, any ETF approval, more than almost any headline this market obsesses over. Let me build this from the ground up. Most people believe inflation is a fact like temperature. You stick a thermometer into the economy and read what it says. That belief is dangerously naive. Inflation measurement is a methodology. It's a set of choices: which goods you include, how you weight them, how you handle substitutions, how you treat housing costs. Change those choices, and you change the number. The economy doesn't move, the number does. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's well-documented history. In 1996, the Boskin Commission, a panel of economists commissioned by the U.S. Senate, concluded that the Consumer Price Index was overstating inflation by roughly 1.1 percentage points per year. The government then quietly adopted methodological changes that, over time, structurally lowered how inflation was reported. Same economy, lower number. Now ask yourself, why does this matter? Because every single rate decision the Federal Reserve makes runs through an inflation reading. If inflation reads high, the Fed holds or hikes. If inflation reads close to target, the Fed cuts. The number is not just a statistic, it is the trigger mechanism for trillions of dollars in global capital flows. And the man now sitting in the chair that controls that number has already told us, publicly and in writing, that he believes the current measurement framework is flawed. Kevin Warsh does not arrive at the Federal Reserve as a neutral custodian. He arrives as a reformer with a documented intellectual framework. Warsh has spent years critiquing the Fed's over-reliance on what he calls rear-view mirror data, economic measurements that lag reality by weeks or months, leading to policy responses that are always slightly behind the actual economy. His written work, including a notable 2016 Wall Street Journal piece co-authored with Stanford economist Michael Spence, argues for a fundamentally different approach, one that emphasizes real-time financial conditions over backward-looking price surveys. Now here's where it gets precise. The Fed has historically used core PCE, personal consumption expenditures, stripped of food and energy, as its preferred inflation gauge. The problem Warsh and others have identified is that core PCE is vulnerable to what statisticians call compositional distortion. If one sector of the economy experiences an unusual price shock, a supply chain disruption, an energy event, a geopolitical spike, it contaminates the overall reading even if the rest of the economy is behaving normally. The alternative gaining traction is called the trimmed mean PCE, a methodology actually developed by the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas and already tracked internally by the Fed. Here's the mechanical difference, explained simply. Standard core PCE strips out categories, specifically food and energy, and averages everything else. Trimmed mean PCE strips out extremes, the top and bottom percentage of price movements across all categories, and averages the middle. Think of it like judging an Olympic diving competition. Standard core PCE is like excluding the judges from two specific countries no matter what scores they give. Trimmed mean PCE is like excluding the single highest and lowest score regardless of where they came from, so the outliers don't skew the result. The structural consequence of this shift is not subtle. Across virtually every recent economic period where both measures have been calculated, trimmed mean PCE has produced a lower inflation reading than core PCE. Not dramatically lower, but consistently lower by enough to matter. And enough to matter at the Federal Reserve means the difference between holding rates and cutting them. Let's slow down here, because this is the piece most analysis skips over. The connection between a Fed methodology change and XRP's price is not direct. It runs through a specific chain of events, and each link in that chain matters. Link 1. The reading changes. Warsh begins publishing trimmed mean PCE alongside or instead of core PCE. The new readings come in lower, let's say 2.3% to 2.5% versus the 3.5% core PCE benchmark the previous framework produced. Same economic conditions, different lens. Link 2. The narrative shifts. Markets are not driven by reality. They are driven by the story that participants tell each other about reality. The moment a credible Fed chair is presenting data showing inflation at 2.3%, the dominant narrative becomes, inflation is essentially solved. Financial media, institutional analysts, and algorithmic trading systems all begin pricing in cuts. Not because cuts have happened, because cuts now feel mathematically inevitable. Link 3. Risk appetite expands. Rate cut expectations do something specific to capital, they push it toward risk. When investors believe that the safest, most guaranteed return in the world's short-term treasury yields is about to fall, they begin moving up the risk curve. Equities get bid up. High-yield credit tightens. And at the furthest end of the risk spectrum, crypto receives capital inflows that simply don't exist in a high-rate, restrictive environment. Link 4. XRP's specific position. Most speculative assets benefit roughly proportionally from a risk-on expansion. XRP does not behave like most speculative assets right now because it carries a layer of institutional optionality that most crypto assets don't. 3 years of regulatory battle with the SEC have created a paradox. It kept XRP suppressed during the bull phase that other crypto assets enjoyed, while simultaneously producing the legal clarity that makes it the most institutionally deployable digital asset in the US market today. Banks can touch it. Payment institutions can integrate it. The infrastructure is built and waiting. When liquidity expands, when the rate cut narrative takes hold, XRP doesn't just benefit from generalized risk appetite. It benefits from institutional deployment of capital into the only crypto asset that has survived regulatory scrutiny with its use case intact. That is not a coincidence of timing, that is a structural setup. Years in the making. There's a second moving piece that almost no retail analysis incorporates correctly. The Fed currently holds approximately $7 trillion in assets on its balance sheet, the accumulated legacy of over a decade of quantitative easing. Warsh has stated clearly that reducing this balance sheet is a long-term goal. But here is the sequencing that matters. You cannot aggressively cut rates and aggressively shrink the balance sheet at the same time without creating deflationary pressure so severe it risks cracking the credit markets. Every serious monetary economist understands this. The Fed understands this. So the sequence is predictable: rate cuts come first, balance sheet reduction comes later, slowly, with extensive forward guidance. That sequencing means the period between the first rate cut and meaningful balance sheet reduction, which could span 18 to 24 months, is a window of expanding monetary conditions. The base rate falls. The balance sheet stays large. Financial conditions loosen. That window is historically when the most violent, most accelerated risk asset appreciation occurs. We've seen this template before, not just in 2021 but in 2009 to 2010, coming out of the financial crisis, when the Fed's first round of QE produced extraordinary returns in every asset class willing to absorb the liquidity. The pattern is not speculation, it is the documented mechanical output of capital, forced to seek return in an environment where safe assets suddenly offer less of it. Let me be honest with you about something that most financial channels will not say plainly. The actual inflation experience of American households is not going to change because Kevin Warsh switches measurement methodologies. Groceries will cost what they cost. Rent will be what it is. The pump price is the pump price. What changes is the official story, and in financial markets, the official story is, in many ways, more powerful than the underlying reality. Because markets are not truth-seeking mechanisms, they are expectation discounting mechanisms. They price what participants believe is coming, not what is actually here. This is not cynical. It is simply accurate. And understanding it is the difference between being the person who waits for the rate cut announcement to buy and being the person who has already positioned themselves 3 months earlier, when the narrative first began to shift. The market does not reward those who wait for certainty. It rewards those who correctly read the direction of the narrative before consensus forms around it. When Warsh's first trimmed mean readings come out lower than what Powell's framework produced, the direction of the narrative will become unmistakable. Inflation solved, cuts incoming, liquidity ahead. The question is not whether that narrative will drive capital into risk assets. It will. The question is whether you understand the mechanism clearly enough to respect what it means for an asset like XRP, positioned precisely at the intersection of a regulatory clearing and a liquidity expansion before the rest of the market catches up. Let me pull every thread together. A new Federal Reserve chair has just taken over. His documented intellectual framework favors a different inflation measurement methodology, one that produces structurally lower readings than the framework it is replacing. Those lower readings create the data environment that justifies initiating rate cuts. Rate cuts launch a period of expanding monetary conditions. Expanding monetary conditions push capital toward risk assets, with the most disproportionate flows going to assets that combine speculative upside with institutional credibility. XRP currently holds that combination uniquely among digital assets. This is not a price prediction. This is a structural analysis of the specific mechanism through which monetary policy changes reach digital asset markets, and why this particular transition, from Powell's framework to Warsh's, is not a footnote in financial history. It is the setup. The key was never a tweet, a partnership announcement, or a court ruling. The key was always the number, and now, for the first time in years, the person controlling that number is someone who has explicitly told us he believes the old number was wrong. That is not a small thing, that is everything. If this changes how you think about the macro picture for XRP, subscribe. No noise, no hype. Just the structural analysis that connects monetary policy to what actually moves markets.